Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The night was calm. The suburban streets bathed in the soft glow of street lights, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly spaced houses. Chief Ryan Carter turned onto his street, exhausted from a grueling 12-hour shift filled with back-to-back calls, endless paperwork, and the usual chaos of running a police department. All he wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. Instead, he was met with something that made his exhaustion instantly turn to irritation. His driveway was blocked by a massive tow truck, its flashing hazard lights bouncing off the pavement. For a split second, Ryan thought maybe it was just some unfortunate neighbor dealing with a car issue, maybe a breakdown or someone calling for a tow after an accident. But as he rolled to a stop, his sharp, experienced eyes caught sight of the man standing beside the truck, clipboard in hand, wearing an all-too-familiar smug expression. Jake Lawson, the so-called compliance officer, or as most of the neighborhood called him, the wannabe cop. Ryan exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Not tonight. He was too damn tired for whatever nonsense this was. Climbing out his car, he barely managed to keep his voice steady. "Move the truck," he said, keeping his tone even but firm. Jake barely spared him a glance before smirking. "Should have paid the fine, bud," he said, tilting his head toward the now empty space where Ryan's personal car had been parked that morning. Ryan's stomach sank. His car was gone. He ran a hand down his face, a slow, creeping realization settling in. Jake dramatically lifted the clipboard as if it were some sacred text. Un paio di fine, $79. Ryan blinked. $79? Yep. Jake continued, clearly enjoying himself. "We sent notices. No payment. No warning needed when you ignore them." Ryan clenched his jaw. "What notices?" Jake shrugged, flipping through the clipboard. "Not my problem. Rules are rules." Ryan pulled out his phone and checked his email. Sure enough, buried under spam and work notifications, was an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Final notice. Urgent. Past due balance $79. The kicker? It had been sent 3 hours ago. Ryan let out a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. He looked up at Jake, who was still grinning like he just won some sort of battle. "Where's my car?" Ryan asked, his voice low. Jake tapped the clipboard. "Impound lot. You can get it back for $250 plus storage fees." Ryan's eye twitched. "So let me get this straight," he said, stepping closer. "You towed my car over a $79 fine before I even had a chance to see the email, and then blocked my own driveway with this truck?" Jake's smirk widened. "That about sums it up." Ryan cracked his neck, suppressing the urge to say something that would make the situation worse. He had arrested gang leaders with less arrogance than this guy. "Move the truck," he said again, his patience dangerously thin. Jake held up a hand. "Oh, I can't do that. You got to settle the fine first. It's policy." Ryan took out his phone, dialing the non-emergency dispatch. The line picked up quickly. "Hey, it's Carter. I need a traffic obstruction unit at my residence." Jake's smirk faltered slightly. "Well, what do you think you're doing?" Ryan met his gaze with ice-cold calm. "Getting your TR moved legally." The tow truck driver, a bulky guy who had been leaning against the truck looking bored, suddenly stood straighter. "Hey man, are you a cop or something?" Jake scoffed. "Doesn't matter. This is HOA jurisdiction. Cops can't do squat." Ryan inhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "That's cute," he muttered. He walked to his mailbox and flipped it open. Sure enough, there was a physical notice inside. Skimming it quickly, his irritation shifted into something far more dangerous: controlled anger. Effective immediately, Ryan Carter has accrued additional violations totaling $500. His eyes darted down. Improperly installed porch light, lawn not in uniform standards, unauthorized mailbox decor. Ryan frowned. Then it hit him, the tiny blue police support sticker on his mailbox. They fined him for that. Jake was enjoying this too much. "Oh yeah, buddy, you got more fines stacking up. This is just the start. You homeowners think you own the place, but we run this neighborhood." Ryan turned back to him, expression unreadable. "You run this neighborhood?" Jake crossed his arms. "That's right, so you better play by the rules." Ryan exhaled slowly. Got it. Jake seemed to think he'd won. Good. Now, if you want, I can waive some of the additional fines if you pay tonight. Ryan held up a hand. Don't bother, he said, stepping back toward his car. How about a better idea? Jake frowned. What are you? Before he could finish, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. 2 squad cars pulled up, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. One of them, Sergeant David Miller, gave Ryan a confused look. Chief, what's going on? Jake's face went pale. Ryan crossed his arms. Oh, didn't I mention? He smiled slightly. I'm the chief of police. Jake visibly swallowed. The tow truck driver froze. Ryan gestured toward the truck. This vehicle is obstructing my property. I'd like it removed immediately. Miller turned to Jake, his tone all business. You got a permit for this tow? Jake fumbled with the clipboard. It's HOA policy, sir. Miller raised an eyebrow. Policy isn't law. You have no legal authority to impound a vehicle without following proper city ordinances. Ryan turned toward Jake, his eyes locked on him. You were saying something about running this neighborhood? Jake opened his mouth, then closed it again. Ryan smirked. Yeah, that's what I thought. The silence was deafening. The HOA's arrogance had met something far worse, real authority. And this was just the beginning. Ryan let the silence stretch, watching as Jake's confidence drained away. The smirk that had been so prominent minutes ago was nowhere to be found. The tow truck driver shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Ryan and Sergeant Miller, clearly re-evaluating the situation. Let's go ahead and get that truck moved. Miller said, his voice cool but firm. Jake hesitated. You can't. Ryan cut him off. I can, and I just did. He turned to the tow truck driver. I assume you'd rather avoid legal trouble? Move it. The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled into the cab and fired up the engine, reversing down the street with more urgency than he had likely ever moved in his life. Jake was still clutching his clipboard like it was a shield. You still have to pay the fine, he said weakly, as if clinging to the last shred of authority he had. Ryan took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. Let me explain something to you, Jake. Policy isn't law. You don't have the authority to seize a vehicle. You don't have the power to block a homeowner's driveway. And you sure as hell don't get to play enforcer when you have no actual legal jurisdiction. Jake tried to recover. The HOA has every right. Miller scoffed. No, it doesn't. And if you did your job properly, you'd know that. He turned to his partner. Run the tow company's permits. Let's see if they're operating legally. Jake took an involuntary step back. Wait. The younger officer returned a moment later, shaking his head. Their permit expired 6 months ago. Ryan's lips twitched into something dangerously close to amusement. So not only was my car illegally towed, but you've been using an unlicensed company to enforce your HOA rules. Jake's breathing was getting heavier. That's not my fault. Sure it is, Ryan replied smoothly. You hired them. You issued the order, and now you're going to explain that to the city. He gestured to Miller. Let them make sure HOA leadership is aware of this. Jake looked like he was about to throw up. You can't call them. Ryan's expression hardened. Oh, but I can and I will. Jake turned as if searching for a way out of this, but there was none. The wannabe enforcer had finally been out enforced. Ryan pulled out his phone, dialing another number. When the line picked up, he didn't bother with pleasantries. Ethan Wallace, this is Chief Ryan Carter. We need to have a conversation. There was a pause, then a slick, measured voice replied. Chief Carter, to what do I owe the pleasure? Ryan didn't miss the forced politeness in Ethan's voice. The HOA president was the kind of man who used charm like a weapon, smooth words to cover sharp edges. But Ryan had dealt with his type before. I'm standing outside my home, Ryan said. Your compliance officer just had my car illegally towed. You want to explain why your HOA thinks it has more authority than actual law enforcement? There was silence on the other end, just a little too long. I see. Ethan finally said, voice tight. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Oh, I'm sure, Ryan replied dryly, which is why I'd suggest you get down here now. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. I'll be there shortly. Ryan hung up and turned back to Jake. You might want to stick around for this. Jake, pale and sweating, nodded stiffly. He wasn't smiling anymore. 15 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up. Ethan Wallace stepped out, dressed in Business casual, his every movement precise and calculated. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, assessing the situation with the ease of a man used to being in control. "Chief Carter," he said smoothly, "I apologize for the inconvenience. I assume we can handle this without unnecessary escalation." Ryan crossed his arms. "That depends. Are you planning on fixing this mess? Or should we go ahead and escalate?" Ethan's eyes flicked to Jake, who looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement. "Jake," he said, voice cool, "is there something you neglected to mention to me?" Jake stammered, "I was just following policy." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple. "And did policy include using an unlicensed tow company to remove a police officer's car?" Jake visibly deflated. "I didn't know they were expired." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Unbelievable." Ryan watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. It was always interesting to see how fast people turn on each other when the walls started closing in. "I assume my car is being returned?" Ryan said. Ethan nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll make sure the fees are waived." "How generous," Ryan said dryly. "Any other fines?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm afraid those stand." Ryan pulled a folded letter from his pocket and held it up. "You mean these?" He glanced down. "Let's see. My violations include my porch light being too bright, my lawn not being uniform, and my mailbox having a support sticker. Tell me, Ethan, do you personally receive the same level of scrutiny from your own HOA?" Ethan's jaw tensed. All homeowners are expected to follow the rules. Ryan's smirk returned. "That's so. Sergeant Miller." Miller stepped forward, holding a printed report. "We pulled public records on Ethan Wallace's property. Seems he has a few violations himself." Ethan's head snapped toward him. "That's private information." "Not to law enforcement," Ryan said. He took the paper, reading aloud. "Unapproved backyard structure, overgrown hedge, porch light out of HOA standard, unauthorized flag display." He looked up. "Should I keep going?" Ethan's expression darkened. "That's not relevant." Ryan folded his arms. "Oh, I think it is because while my tiny sticker was enough to get me fined, you seem to be getting a free pass." He tilted his head. "That almost sounds like selective enforcement." Ethan's nostrils flared. "This is ridiculous." "No," Ryan said. "What's ridiculous is that you're running this HOA like a personal racket. And trust me when I say this isn't over." Ethan took a slow breath, visibly restraining himself. "You're making a mistake, Chief." Ryan smiled. "No, Ethan, you did, and now you're going to answer for it." Ethan Wallace stepped onto the pavement with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His SUV gleamed under the streetlights, the pristine image of someone who had mastered the art of control. His neatly pressed shirt and calm demeanor were meant to exude authority, but Ryan Carter had seen that kind of polished arrogance before. It was the same look worn by corporate executives who thought their money, why an influence put them above the law. "Chief Carter," Ethan said smoothly, offering a professional nod. "I apologize for any confusion. I assume we can resolve this in a civil manner." His tone was light, but there was an underlying steel to it, a veiled threat disguised as diplomacy. Ryan didn't budge. "No confusion on my end. Your compliance officer here just had my car towed, over a $79 fine, before I even had a chance to read notice. And I've just learned that your HOA has been using an unlicensed tow company for months. So tell me, Ethan, what exactly are we resolving?" Ethan's jaw twitched, his eyes flicking to Jake, who looked like he wanted to melt into the pavement. The wannabe enforcer was barely breathing, his earlier bravado gone. "Jake?" Ethan asked, his voice controlled but sharp. Jake swallowed hard. "I was just following protocol." Ryan cut in. "Your protocol includes illegally towing vehicles, obstructing private property, and selectively targeting homeowners you don't like." Ethan sighed, as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than a growing legal disaster. "If a mistake was made, I assure you it will be corrected. There's no need for unnecessary escalation." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You think this is me escalating? Trust me, you're not going to like what actual escalation looks like." Ethan's carefully curated calm faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. "Chief, let's be reasonable. The HOA has the right to enforce community standards. Ryan smirked. You mean like the standards you're currently violating? Ethan stiffened, his mask cracking just a little. Ryan pulled out the printed report Miller had handed him earlier and held it up. Public records. Seems like you got a few violations of your own. Backyard structure not approved by the HOA. Hedge overgrowth. Porch light out of standard compliance. Unauthorized flag display. Should I keep going? The shift in Ethan's body language was subtle, but Ryan caught it. The slight tightening of his grip, the sharp inhale through his nose. You're overstepping, Chief, Ethan said, his voice just a little less smooth than before. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the words hit harder. Am I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've built your nice little empire by making sure the rules only apply to other people. Ethan forced a chuckle. These accusations are baseless. Ryan held up the HOA's latest notice against him. So, a police officer gets fined for a tiny support sticker on his mailbox, but the president of the HOA gets to ignore violations on his own property? That's not just selective enforcement, Ethan. That's corruption. Miller, standing to the side, crossed his arms. We're going to need access to HOA financial records. Ethan's eyes snapped to him. That's private. Not when there's suspected fraud, Ryan replied. And right now, I'd say there's plenty of reason to suspect exactly that. Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're overstepping your authority, Chief. Ryan tilted his head. At authority, do you think you have? Because let me be perfectly clear, your policies don't override law, and you don't get to use your position to squeeze money out of homeowners for personal gain. The first flicker of real unease crossed Ethan's face. I don't know what you think you're implying. Miller's radio crackled. Sergeant, we've got confirmation that the tow company has been illegally operating without a valid permit. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. Ryan turned back to him. Illegal towing, selective enforcement, financial misconduct. What do you think happens next? A bead of sweat formed at Ethan's temple, but he wiped it away quickly, maintaining his facade. This is all circumstantial. Ryan's smirk deepened. That's funny, because it sounded a lot like we're about to find out exactly how deep this corruption runs. At that moment, another set of headlights approached. A sleek car rolled to a stop, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had talked his way out of 100 bad situations. The HOA's lawyer. Ethan turned to him, relief flashing across his face. About time. The lawyer adjusted his tie and offered Ryan a tight smile. Chief Carter, I assume there's been a misunderstanding? Ryan crossed his arms. No misunderstanding, just a whole lot of illegal activity. The lawyer's smile didn't waver. I see. And I assume you have evidence to support these claims? Ryan held up the violation report. The illegal tow operation. That's already confirmed. Selective enforcement documented. And once we get a look at HOA financial records, I have a feeling we'll find a whole lot more. The lawyer's confidence flickered. Chief, this is an internal matter. There's no need for law enforcement involvement. Ryan's grin was anything but friendly. Oh, see, that's where you're wrong. Because when you start running an HOA like a personal criminal enterprise, it becomes my problem. Ethan's patience snapped. You don't have the power to come after us. Ryan's smile turned razor sharp. Oh, but I do. And trust me, Ethan, you're about to find out exactly what that means. The air was thick with tension as Ethan Wallace's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His lawyer had barely managed to keep up the pretense of confidence, but Ryan Carter could see it. The shift, the moment when a man realizes the walls are closing in and there's no way out. Jake, the so-called compliance officer, stood off to the side, pale and sweating. He had started the night drunk on power, convinced that his clipboard and title gave him authority over everyone in the neighborhood. Now he looked like a man standing on a cliff's edge, one misstep away from a long fall. The squad cars were still parking nearby, lights flashing in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. The tow truck was long gone, forced to leave after its illegal operations had been exposed. But that was just the first domino. Ryan turned to Miller, keeping his voice calm but firm. Run a background check on the HOA financials. Sharp stepped forward. You have no right. Ryan cut him off with a look. Watch me. Miller was already speaking into his radio. coordinating with the fraud division. Meanwhile, one of the younger officers had been flipping through the documents they had managed to pull from public records. "Chief," he called out, stepping forward with a printed report in hand. "You're going to want to see this." Ryan took the papers and scanned them quickly. Then he chuckled a dark, humorless laugh. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Ryan lifted the sheet. "You've been charging extra fees on every fine you issue. Fines that, by the way, have been way above the legal HOA limit." Ethan's lawyer cleared his throat. "Those funds go toward community maintenance." Ryan's smirk didn't fade. "That's funny because they seem to be going to an LLC registered in Ethan Wallace's name." Silence. Jake's head snapped toward Ethan. "Wait, what?" Ryan tilted his head. "You didn't know? All that fine money you've been enforcing wasn't going into the HOA's account. It was padding Ethan's personal wallet." Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "He said it was all legal." Ryan glanced at Miller. "Sergeant, if someone's been misappropriating funds from a homeowners association for personal use, what do we call that?" Miller didn't hesitate. "Fraud and embezzlement." Ethan's lawyer's face darkened. "Chief Carter, I strongly suggest we take a step back and discuss this privately." Ryan smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "Oh, I think we're past that." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his last vestiges of control slipping away. "You don't know what you're doing." Carter Rand stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the words sting. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Ethan. And the best part? This time you don't have the power." The tension in the air was palpable. Jake took another step back, realizing the ship he had been so proud to serve on was sinking fast. Ryan turned back to the young officer. "What else did you find?" The officer flipped a few pages, eyes scanning quickly. Then he whistled. "Oh man, this is bad." Ryan lifted a brow. "How bad?" The officer looked up. "Misused HOA funds for personal travel, private dinners, and get this, a vacation home in Florida." That was it, the final nail. The neighborhood had started gathering, neighbors stepping out onto their porches, watching and whispering. Phones were up, recording. Ethan's mask cracked completely. His breath was shallow, his shoulders tight. Ryan exhaled slowly. "Time to end this. You really thought you were untouchable, didn't you?" Ryan asked, voice quiet but firm. "You thought nobody would check, that people would just keep paying, keep complying because you had a fancy title and a clipboard-wielding lackey to do your dirty work." Ethan swallowed, but he had no words left. Ryan stepped aside and nodded to Miller. "Ethan Wallace," Miller said, stepping forward and pulling out his cuffs. "You're under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power." Ethan barely had time to react before Miller grabbed his wrist and snapped the cuffs in place. The crowd erupted in cheers, laughter, and clapping. Jake panicked. "Wait, I didn't know any of this. I was just following orders." Ryan turned to him, tilting his head. "Funny, that's what corrupt enforcers always say." Jake lifted his hands, desperate. "I'll cooperate. I'll give you everything, please." Ryan studied him for a long moment, then looked to Miller. "If he cooperates, how much leniency could the DA offer?" Miller shrugged. "Could be significant depending on what he provides." Jake nodded furiously. "I'll talk, I swear." Ethan, still struggling against his cuffs, glared at him. "You traitorous little," Ryan leaned in. "Looks like your house of cards just collapsed." Ethan's face was twisted in fury. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Carter. I have lawyers, connections. You think you've won?" Ryan smirked. "No, Ethan. I know I have 2 officers." He led Ethan toward the squad car, his protest getting weaker as reality set in. Jake, still standing there, ran a shaking hand through his hair. Ryan looked around at the gathered neighbors, people who had spent years under the weight of this corrupt HOA. He lifted his voice. "If you've been fined unfairly by Ethan Wallace and his board, now's your chance to come forward." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then an elderly woman stepped forward. "You fined me $500 for planting tulips," she said, her voice shaking. Another man followed. "He threatened to foreclose on my house over a fence violation." And then, like a dam breaking, the stories poured out. Ryan nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like we're going to need a bigger investigation." The crowd cheered again, and Ryan glanced at Miller. "This HOA," Ryan said, "it's done." Miller grinned. "And Ethan Wallace?" Ryan smirked as the squad car door slammed shut behind the now former HOA president. "Oh," Ryan said, "he's going exactly where he belongs." The neighborhood felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off its shoulders. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, bleeding homeowners dry with fines, threats, and selective enforcement. But tonight, that reign had come to an end. Ethan Wallace was gone, handcuffed and loaded into the back of a squad car, his lawyer scrambling to salvage what was left of his reputation. Jake, the once smug enforcer, stood off to the side, deflated and defeated, knowing he had no choice but to turn on the very system he had once enforced. Ryan Carter exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax, if only for a moment. This wasn't over. Not yet, but the worst of it was behind them. The neighbors who had once lived in quiet fear of the HOA were now speaking up, sharing stories of how they had been harassed, overcharged, and targeted. The anger in their voices was real, but so was the relief, the realization that for the first time in years, they could fight back. Sergeant Miller stood next to Ryan, flipping through paperwork from the HOA's records. "This is worse than we thought," he muttered. Wallace wasn't just pocketing fines. He was moving HOA funds into personal accounts, accounts paying off the board, and even funneling money into bogus maintenance fees that never actually went toward repairs. Ryan nodded. No surprise there. "What happens next?" "The state takes over," Miller replied. "Fraud investigation will expand, and the HOA's accounts will be frozen. Every fine issued under Wallace's leadership will be reviewed and likely refunded." The crowd had gone quiet, but the moment the word refunded left Miller's mouth, there was a collective gasp followed by a wave of cheers. Homeowners who had been forced to pay hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars in unfair fines were about to get their money back. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had been fined for planting tulips, covered her mouth with both hands, eyes welling up with tears. "I thought I'd never see that money again," she whispered. Mr. Patel, who had nearly lost his home over a fence violation, clenched his jaw. "That man tried to ruin lives," he said, shaking his head. "Now look at him." Ryan glanced toward the squad car where Ethan sat, stone-faced, staring ahead, refusing to look at the neighbors he had wronged. No more arrogance, no more smug confidence, just a man who had lost everything. Miller crossed his arms. "And what about the HOA itself?" A city inspector who had arrived as the situation unfolded stepped forward. "By state law, a homeowners association under criminal investigation has two options. They can elect a new board under government oversight, or the homeowners can vote to dissolve it entirely." That got everyone's attention. Ryan had already seen it coming. The neighbors didn't want a new board. They didn't trust the system anymore. Jim, the retired Marine, stepped up, hands on his hips. "So what you're saying is if we all vote, we can get rid of the HOA for good?" The inspector nodded. "If the majority agrees, yes." Mrs. Henderson raised a trembling hand. "All in favor of burning this HOA to the ground." Every single hand shot up. Laughter and applause erupted as neighbors cheered the downfall of the very organization that had made their lives miserable for years. The inspector chuckled. "Well, that was easy. I'll get the paperwork started." Ryan shook his head with amusement. He had spent years dealing with criminals, gangs, and corporate corruption, but there was something especially satisfying about watching a neighborhood take its power back. Jim clapped him on the back. "Chief, I think you just made yourself a neighborhood legend." Mrs. Henderson grinned. "We should put a picture of Wallace's arrest in the old HOA office." Ryan smirked. "Might be the first thing that office ever did that people actually liked." Jim looked around at the gathered neighbors. "So what happens now? Do we still have neighborhood rules?" The inspector nodded. "Without an HOA, city ordinances apply instead. Noise complaints, parking violations, property disputes, it'll all be handled by normal legal channels. No more HOA fines, no more compliance officers, no more selective enforcement." Someone from the back shouted, "So that means I can finally paint at my house the color I want more." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Mr. Patel crossed his arms. "Honestly, I think we'll be fine without an HOA. If there's a real issue, we'll handle it as neighbors. Ryan exhaled, looking around. This was what a real community looked like, not a rigid system of control, but people working together. Sergeant Miller glanced over. And what about you, Chief? You ever think about running for HOA president? Before we set it on fire, Ryan laughed. Not a chance. I deal with real criminals. Mrs. Henderson smirked. What if we call it the Ryan Carter Protection Association? More laughter. Ryan shook his head. Nope. If you need me, just call 911 like normal people. As the night continued, the celebrations only grew. Someone lit a bonfire. One by one, neighbors tossed old HOA violation notices into the flames. Some added copies of the ridiculous rule book, while others burned their final HOA fee statements in pure satisfaction. Jim added the final touch, a giant campaign poster of Ethan Wallace from when he first ran for HOA president. It went up in flames instantly. Ryan watched the embers rise, listening to the sound of freedom. The neighborhood had suffered for years under a corrupt system. Tonight, they had won. Miller nudged him. Not bad, huh? Ryan exhaled. Not bad at all. Ryan Carter sat on his front porch, watching the last remnants of the bonfire flicker out. The neighborhood had changed overnight. No more patrol trucks lurking around corners. No more violation notices taped to doors like threats. No more smug enforcers with clipboards pretending they had real power. The weight that had sat heavy on this community for years was finally gone. The HOA was dead, its corrupt leadership exposed and dismantled. Ethan Wallace was in custody, facing charges that would likely put him away for a long time. Jake had flipped, spilling every dirty secret the HOA had tried to bury. Homeowners were getting their money back, their records cleared, and their freedom restored. For most, this was the end of the fight, but for Ryan, something told him it was only the beginning. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that night. He glanced down, expecting another update from Miller or the Brad investigators. But instead, his inbox was flooded with messages from people he didn't even know. You have no idea how satisfying that takedown was. My HOA is just as bad. Any advice on fighting back? I think I just watched the best revenge story in history. Please tell me this is going to be a series. HOAs are out of control, and we need someone to stand up to them. Ryan scrolled through the endless stream of emails, messages, and social media notifications. It wasn't just one neighborhood. It wasn't just one corrupt HOA. This was everywhere. Homeowners from across the country were begging for help, desperate for someone to challenge the unchecked power of their own associations. Fines over trivial violations, threats of foreclosure, selective enforcement. It was all the same story, just with different names. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had gone after criminals his whole life, but this was something different. A system so deeply embedded in suburban life that people just accepted it as the cost of living in a nice neighborhood. But now they were waking up, and they were angry. A notification popped up from Miller. Miller thought you'd want to see this. HOA investigations expanding statewide. Other HOAs under review. This thing is bigger than we thought. Ryan? Ryan smirked. He had a feeling that was the case. Another buzz, a message from Jim. Dude, we bought Ethan Wallace's beach house. HOA Revenge Tour 2025, you in? Ryan burst out laughing. Of all the ways this could have ended, that was poetic justice. The neighborhood had come together, not just to take back their streets, but to take back what was stolen. Ethan Wallace had spent years bleeding homeowners dry, and now his prized vacation home belonged to the very people he had tried to control. Ryan leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. His inbox wasn't slowing down. The messages kept pouring in. People weren't just celebrating the takedown. They were asking for help. They were asking for a leader. He thought about everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. One corrupt HOA had fallen, but there were thousands more just like it. And if there was one thing Ryan had learned, it was this. Most HOAs only had power because nobody stood up to them. Maybe that needed a change. He opened his social media app, fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before he started typing. Is your HOA corrupt? Have you been fined for ridiculous reasons? Tell me your story. Let's bring these power-hungry pants down together. He hit post. Within seconds, The notifications started flooding in. Ryan didn't know what would happen next. Would this become a movement, a full-blown investigation, a nationwide crackdown? One thing was certain. HOAs weren't ready for what was coming.